Alaska, a territory for the physically and mentally strong. Good evening, friends. Tonight, we venture into the frozen darkness of Alaska, where only the strong survive. These terrifying tales will test your nerves. I'd like to know your location and what time you're watching from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers and unlock more chilling stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold, if you dare. The hardest part isn't telling you what happened out there. The hardest part is making you understand what kind of person I was before it happened, because the person I was before and the person telling you this now are separated by something that cannot be measured in miles or days or degrees of temperature, and if you don't understand who I was going in, you won't understand what was taken from me coming out. My name is irrelevant. What is relevant is this: I was 38 years old, I was healthy, I had a valid instrument rating and over 900 hours of flight time, and I had flown the interior of Alaska in small aircraft more times than I could count without it once occurring to me that I might not come back. That's not bravado, that's the specific cognitive distortion that accumulates in competent people who have done dangerous things many times without consequence. You stop calculating the risk because the risk has never materialized, and the absence of consequence begins to feel, irrationally and lethally, like evidence of its impossibility. I was a good pilot. I had the logbooks to prove it. And good pilots don't crash. I was flying a Piper PA-18 Super Cub, a single-engine tailtrigger, the workhorse of Alaskan bush aviation, on what should have been a 3-hour repositioning flight from McGrath to a private strip near the Kuskokwim Mountains where a group of hunters needed their gear moved. The weather briefing out of McGrath had been acceptable. Not ideal, there was a low-pressure system developing to the northwest, but acceptable for the route and well within my experience. I filed my flight plan, called the hunters to confirm my ETA, and lifted off at 11:40 in the morning on a September day that looked, from the ground, exactly the way September in interior Alaska always looks: gray-white sky, spruce trees going dark and still below, the particular washed-out quality of northern light in autumn that makes everything look slightly overexposed, slightly less real than it should be. 40 minutes out of McGrath, the weather changed the way Alaskan weather changes when you are in a small aircraft and there is nothing you can do about it. Suddenly and completely and without any of the visual warning cues that briefings and training in 900 hours of experience had taught me to expect. The ceiling dropped. Not gradually. It simply dropped, the way a curtain drops when someone cuts the rope holding it. One moment I had a ceiling of roughly 1,800 feet and a visibility of 6 miles, and the next moment I was in cloud with zero forward visibility, the altimeter winding down, the airspeed indicator fluctuating in the turbulence, and a mountain range somewhere in front of me that I could no longer see. I will not walk you through the technical sequence of the next 4 minutes. Partly because I have already relived it in depositions and NTSB interviews more times than I can count, and I am tired of the clinical language of accident reports, and partly because the technical sequence is not the story. The story is what happened after. The 4 minutes ended with the aircraft impacting a ridge on the eastern slope of the Alaska Range at approximately 40 miles north of the Farewell Lake airstrip, which might as well be on the moon for how accessible it is without a functioning aircraft. And when I came back to awareness, I was hanging sideways in my harness with the smell of aviation fuel heavy in my nostrils and the sound of the wind through the broken windshield, and the understanding, arriving slowly and then all at once, like a wave that has been building far offshore, that I was alive and that I was alone and that the temperature outside was going to kill me if I did not immediately begin making decisions. My left collarbone was broken. I knew this the way you know things about your own body in extremis, not through diagnosis but through the specific, nauseating language of structural failure that your skeleton communicates directly to your brain, bypassing everything in between. My left arm was therefore largely decorative. My head had hit something, the side window, the instrument panel. I couldn't reconstruct the sequence, and there was blood drying along my jawline that I could feel tightening as the cold air hit it. My right side was functional. My legs were functional. My emergency kit was in the baggage compartment of the Cub, which had separated from the fuselage on impact and was somewhere on the ridge behind me. I want you to understand what I am describing. I want you to take your most familiar, comfortable moment, sitting on your couch, watching something on a streaming service you pay $12 a month for, your phone charging on the armrest, your refrigerator humming in the kitchen 20 feet away, and I want you to subtract everything. The couch, the show, the phone, the refrigerator, the wall behind you, the floor under you, the roof over you, the street outside, the city around the street. All of it. Subtract every single layer of infrastructure and comfort and human presence until what remains is you, one broken bone, a bleeding head, a useless arm, and a ridgeline in the Alaska range in September with a low-pressure system moving over you and the temperature already below zero and dropping, and the nearest human being so far away they might as well be a theoretical concept. That is what I am describing. And the horror of it, the true, suffocating, primordial horror of it, is not that it's extreme. It's that it's simple. All the complexity of your American life, all the appointments and the passwords and the insurance premiums and the opinion you have about the best route to take to work, all of it reduces, instantly and ruthlessly, to a single question: can you make your body survive until someone finds it? I found the emergency kit. This took 40 minutes and cost me in ways I am still paying for, the collarbone grinding with every step over the broken terrain, the wind picking up from the northwest with the malicious consistency of something that has decided to finish what it started. The kit had a bivy sack, a small fire starting kit, 2 days of emergency rations, a handheld radio, and a personal locator beacon. I activated the PLB immediately. The light blinked. The signal went up. Somewhere a satellite received it. Somewhere, theoretically, a human being was looking at a screen that now had a new dot on it, and that dot was me, and help was coming. That was the rational sequence. I held onto that sequence the way you hold onto a rope in dark water, not because you're certain it will hold, but because letting go is the only thing more terrifying than holding on. I built a fire. This took everything I had, functionally one-handed, in wind, with wood that had been exposed to snow and was not cooperative. I will not romanticize this. There is nothing romantic about lying on your side on frozen ground feeding a struggling fire with your functioning hand while your broken collarbone makes its presence known every time you breathe and the cold is dismantling you from the outside inward, your fingers losing precision first, then sensation, the cold working its way into your core with the methodical patience of something that is all the time in the world. I got the fire burning. Small. Inadequate. Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with the fact that it was the only thing on that ridge that was on my side. The first night, I was rational. I was scared, deeply, physically scared, the kind of fear that lives in your stomach and radiates outward and makes your hands shake even when they're warm, but I was functional. I rationed my food. I maintained the fire. I transmitted on the radio every 30 minutes, distress calls that went into the static and came back as nothing. I thought about my sister in Juneau, who was the emergency contact on my flight plan. I thought about the hunters near the Kuskokwim who were waiting on their gear and would notice when I didn't arrive. I thought about the NTSB investigator who would eventually walk this ridge and piece together what remained. I thought these thoughts in an organized and sequential way because organization was the only thing standing between me and the other thing, the thing underneath rational thought that was pressing upward with enormous pressure and that I could feel in my peripheral consciousness the way you feel a headache beginning before it fully arrives. On the second day the temperature dropped to what I later learned was 43 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. You have not felt 43 below. I say that not condescendingly but factually. The human body in those conditions enters a state that is genuinely incompatible with clear cognition. The cold is not an absence of warmth. It is a presence, a physical force with weight and intention, and it presses against every surface of your body simultaneously with the blunt persistence of something trying to get in. My fire was not adequate for 43 below. I knew this and could do nothing about it. My rations were gone. My radio transmissions were going out and coming back empty. The PLB was still blinking. That was all I had, one blinking light and the mathematical probability that someone was looking for me. And then, on the afternoon of the second day, I heard the voices. I need to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left to offer. I was conscious. Not lucid in the full sense, the cold had taken significant edge off my cognition by that point, and I was experiencing the particular unreality that hypothermia produces, where the boundary between what is happening and what the brain is generating from its own distress becomes permeable and unreliable, but I was not asleep. I was sitting against the fuselage of the aircraft with the bivvy wrapped around me and my fire reduced to coals, and I heard voices from approximately 30 yards down the ridgeline. Male voices. American English. One of them said my name. Not my pilot call sign. Not a generic survival call. My name. The full name on my birth certificate that would not have been on any flight plan or emergency contact form without a first and last together. My name, in a voice that carried through the wind with the specific clarity of a voice that is close. I shouted back. I stood up, which caused me an agony, and I shouted until my throat was raw, and then I listened and the voices came back, closer now, and one of them said, I can still hear this with a clarity that no other memory from those days possesses. We've got you, stay where you are, we're coming to you. And I sat back down and I wept, which I am not ashamed to tell you, the shaking, ugly weeping of a man who has been carrying a weight for 2 days that was designed to crush him and has just been told he can put it down. Nobody came. I waited. An hour, maybe more, time had lost its structure by then. The voices did not come again. I walked, badly, the 30 yards down the ridgeline to where they had seemed to originate and found nothing. No footprints in the snow. In snow that would have held a footprint from a bird. Nothing. The wind. The gray light. The ridge running empty in both directions until the visibility closed it off. Nothing and no one, in silence so total it had a physical quality, a pressure against the eardrums, as if the air itself had solidified. I went back to the fire and I did not allow myself to think about what that meant. I rebuilt the fire. I got it burning. I sat inside the bivvy and I said out loud to the empty ridge, I am not going to die here. I said it several times. I am uncertain whether I was addressing myself or something else. The rescue team found me early on the third day. 2 Alaska State Troopers and a search and rescue coordinator out of Talkeetna who had been running a grid search since my PLB signal came in. They snowshowed the last mile to me, and the look on the first trooper's face when he saw me, the specific relief of a man who expected to find a body and instead found a person, is something I will carry for the rest of my life. They gave me heat packs and calories and got me onto a sled and moving, and I did not stop shaking for approximately 6 hours. I asked them in the helicopter, when I had enough warmth in me to form coherent sentences, about the other team. The team that had reached me on the second afternoon. I described what I'd heard, the voices, my name, the words "we've got you." The trooper looked at the SAR coordinator. The coordinator looked at me. There was no other team. They had pulled every available resource for the search. They knew every team in the field by GPS transponder and radio contact. Nobody had been within 20 miles of my position on the afternoon of the second day. Nobody. I was the only signal on the ridge. The only one. I told them about the footprints, the absence of footprints, and the trooper wrote something in his notebook and nodded in the careful way that people nod when they are deciding how seriously to take what you're saying. And the coordinator told me that auditory hallucinations were documented in hypothermic subjects and severe stress events, and that what I'd experienced was almost certainly my brain generating comfort stimuli in response to mortal threat. I nodded. It was a rational explanation. I accepted it. I was in the hospital in Anchorage for 11 days. Collarbone surgery, frostbite treatment on 3 fingers of my left hand, which I will never have full sensation in again. My sister flew up from Juneau and sat with me and cried, and I let her because it seemed to help her more than me. The NTSB investigator came and we went through the accident sequence 3 times. A therapist visited twice, asked about trauma responses, left me a pamphlet about PTSD that I read once and then folded into thirds and put at the bottom of my bag. What the pamphlet did not cover, what the hypothermia explanation does not cover, what I have spent 14 months unable to fully file away into any available category, is this. 3 weeks after I was released from the hospital, my sister called me from Juneau. She had been going through paperwork, insurance forms, the accident report, the search and rescue incident file she'd requested from the state for the insurance claim. She called me at 9 in the morning and she said my name the way people say your name when something is wrong, with a pause before and after it, a careful space in which the information is going to arrive. She told me that the SAR incident file included the radio logs from the search. All transmissions, time-stamped, logged automatically by the system, standard procedure. She had read through them looking for the formal declaration of search commencement so she could establish the timeline for the insurance company. There were transmissions in the log from the afternoon of the second day, from the hours when I heard the voices. Time-stamped. Logged. Originating from a frequency consistent with a ground team radio. The content had been transcribed by the logging system, automated voice to text, imperfect but functional. The content was my name, repeated. And then, "We've got you, stay where you are, we're coming to you." My sister read this to me over the phone and neither of us said anything for a long time. The trooper had told me there was no team. The coordinator had told me there was no team. And I believed them because I had no reason not to, and because the alternative, whatever the alternative was not a place I was ready to go and perhaps still am not. I asked my sister who the transmissions were attributed to in the log. She was quiet for a moment. She said the origin field on all 3 transmissions was blank. Not redacted. Not corrupted. Blank, as if the system had received the transmission and logged it and searched for a source identifier and found nothing. A voice on a radio frequency from a ground team that did not exist, saying words that kept a man alive, with no origin and no explanation and no footprints in the snow. My sister asked me what I thought it meant. I told her I didn't know. I still fly. Not in Alaska, not anymore. I have a job ferrying small aircraft between regional airports in the Pacific Northwest, which is never warm but is never 43 below, and where there are always roads visible below me in towns and the comfortable geometry of human habitation. I sleep reasonably well. I function. I do not shake when the weather changes. But there are nights, still, 14 months later, when I wake at 2 or 3 in the morning with the absolute, cellular certainty that someone is standing outside my apartment window. Not a burglar. Not a threat in any category I can name. Just a presence. Patient. Quiet. The way something would stand if it had found what it came looking for and was waiting to see if you acknowledge it. I don't get up. I don't look. I lie in the dark and I count my breaths and I tell myself what the coordinator told me: auditory hallucinations, hypothermic cognition, a traumatized brain generating comfort in extremis. I tell myself this and it is probably true and I am probably fine and none of this probably means anything. But I keep the radio on my nightstand. The same handheld unit from the survival kit. The one I transmitted on for 2 days into static that never answered back, except that it did answer back, except that something answered back, except that whatever saved my life on that ridge is logged in a government file with an empty origin field and no footprints and no explanation. I keep it closed because some part of me, the part that was on that ridge, the part that heard its own name called in a voice that should not have been there, needs to believe that if it happens again, if the cold comes back, if I end up somewhere too far from everything that I love and too close to the edge of whatever waits on the other side of consciousness, something out there will answer. The terrifying part, the part one cannot make peace with, the part that wakes me at 3 in the morning, is that I am no longer certain whether I am hoping for rescue or whether, after everything, I have already been claimed. We moved to Alaska because of a Zillow listing. I need you to sit with that for a moment, the absolute mundane American stupidity of it. A Zillow listing. The same website where you scroll through overpriced condos in cities you can't afford, where you play the game of fantasy real estate at midnight because you hate your apartment and your commute and the 3-inch gap between your car and the neighbor's car in the parking lot and the way your daughter comes home from school with other kids' germs and a drawing of a house with a yard that you do not have and cannot afford within 90 miles of your current zip code. That's the website. That's the gateway. Somebody in an office somewhere posted photographs of a log cabin on 80 acres outside of a tiny community called Talkeetna, roughly 115 miles north of Anchorage, and the listing price was so obscenely low that I showed my wife Renata the screen at 11:30 on a Thursday night, and she looked at it for a long time and said, very quietly, "Why not?" 2 words. That's what it cost us. I was 36. Renata was 34. Our daughter Callie had just turned 6 in August and had recently informed us, with the solemn authority that 6-year-olds deploy when they have made a final decision, that she wanted a dog and a yard and snow. We were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Federal Way, Washington, 40 minutes south of Seattle on a good traffic day and 40 minutes south of Seattle on no traffic day because there were no good traffic days anymore. I worked remotely as a network security analyst. Renata did freelance graphic design. We were, on paper, the perfect candidates for geographic liberation, untethered from a specific office, unbothered by urban amenities we'd long ago stopped affording, the kind of young American family that lifestyle magazines profile with golden hour photographs and captions about choosing meaning over convenience. We were also, and I cannot stress this enough, completely and catastrophically unprepared for what we were choosing. The cabin was real. The 80 acres were real. The listing price, $187,000, which in the lower 48 wouldn't buy you a studio apartment in a city with a functioning economy, was real, and the reason for it only became real to us after we'd signed the papers and done the inspection, which was performed by a man named Dale out of Talkeetna who had the weathered, affectless manner of someone who has stopped being surprised by the decisions other people make. Dale told us the roof needed work. He told us the well pump was original to the 1970s construction and would require replacement within the year. He told us the driveway was technically a fire road and would be impassable from late October through mid-April without a vehicle that cost more than most people's mortgages. He told us these things in a flat, informational tone and wrote them in the inspection report and said nothing else, and what he did not say, what nobody said, not Dale, not the listing agent, not the sellers who had lasted 11 months before quietly imploding and retreating to Anchorage, was the thing that would have mattered most. He did not say, the wilderness here is not backdrop. It is not scenery. It is the primary reality of this location, and everything else, including you, is temporary and provisional within it. Nobody said that. So we moved in on September 1st, which is criminally late to be establishing yourself in a remote Alaskan property if you don't know what you're doing, and we spent the first 3 weeks in a state of effortful, performative joy that I now recognize as the psychological immune response to overwhelming doubt. We stacked wood. We learned the well pump. We enrolled Callie in a small school in Talkeetna, which meant a 40-minute drive each way on a road that changed character completely every time it rained. We bought a dog, a year-old husky mix from a rescue in Wasilla that Callie named Buckle, for reasons she either couldn't or wouldn't explain, and we photographed him in the snow that came in mid-September, the first snow, and we posted the photographs to Instagram because that is what you do when you have made a large decision and need external validation that it was the right one. The likes rolled in. The heart emojis. The comments that said goals and living the dream, and I'm so jealous. Renata and I stood in our kitchen looking at the phone screen, and the fire in the wood stove was going, and Callie was asleep down the hall, and Buckle was on the rug, and it looked, from a certain angle, exactly the way we had imagined it would look. That angle required not looking at the darkness outside the kitchen window. The complete, total, lightless darkness that begins about 8 feet beyond the glass and continues, uninterrupted by any human structure or light source, for roughly 80 miles in 3 directions. That darkness. I need to spend a moment on that darkness, because I have lived in cities my entire life and I had no correct model for what that darkness was. City darkness is never actual darkness. It is orange-gray, sodium-lit, full of the ambient glow of a million other lives being lived nearby. You are never alone in city darkness. You are embedded in a network of other consciousness, other electricity, other heat. The darkness outside our cabin windows was something else entirely. It was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something that light had not yet touched and might never touch, something old and patient and with no particular interest in whether we were comfortable. I would stand at the kitchen sink after dinner, doing dishes, looking at my own reflection in the window glass with that darkness behind it, and I would have the thought, intrusive, involuntary, arriving before I could block it, that the darkness was looking back. Renata felt it too, but we didn't talk about it directly for a long time. We talked around it. We talked about how adjusting to the quiet was taking longer than expected. We talked about how the nights felt different here. We talked about how we'd underestimated the transition. All of this was code for the thing we couldn't say directly, which was, we had moved to a place where the scale of the non-human world so completely dwarfed the human that our presence here felt less like a choice and more like a miscalculation, less like living and more like being tolerated. And the question that arrived with the darkness, every night, was whether the toleration was permanent or conditional. I told myself, this is an adjustment period. Everyone goes through this. Dale the inspector probably felt this way when he first moved up here, and now he's perfectly fine, inspecting properties with that flat, unimpressed energy, completely acclimated. Then came the morning we found the first track. October, 2 weeks in. I went out at 6:30 to split wood before Renata got up and found, in the snow alongside the cabin wall directly below the kitchen window, a track I couldn't identify. Larger than any canid I knew, larger than Buckle's prints by a factor that troubled me, and bipedal. 2 feet, not 4. Not bear, which I knew. Bears in this region were in or approaching denning behavior by October, and their tracks are immediately, unmistakably ursine. This was not that. The spacing between prints suggested something moving slowly, deliberately, along the length of the wall. They came from the tree line. They stopped at the wall. They did not continue in any direction that I could find. They simply stopped. At the wall. Below the window. As if whatever made them had pressed itself against the log exterior and stayed there, and then ceased to exist. I told Renata it was probably a neighbor's dog. We didn't have neighbors within 4 miles, but the explanation was available and I deployed it, and she accepted it the way you accept an explanation that you know is probably wrong but that serves the immediate psychological need. We didn't tell Callie. We put Buckle out on a longer lead and watched him, and he was agitated in a way he hadn't been before, not barking, not aggressive, but vigilant in the way animals are vigilant when they have registered something in their environment that they cannot locate and cannot categorize. He stood at the end of his lead and faced the tree line, and he trembled finely, constantly, for 3 days. On the 4th day he stopped eating. I am trying to be careful here about the order of events because the order matters and because in memory, under sufficient distress, events tend to compress and rearrange themselves in ways that distort causation. So let me be precise. Buckle stopped eating on the 17th of October. On the 19th, I found the second set of tracks, same profile, closer to the cabin, running along the south wall now, the wall with Callie's bedroom window. On the 21st, I drove to Talkeetna and spoke to a man at the sporting goods store who had lived in the area for 30 years, and I described the tracks to him, and he asked me several questions about the dimensions and the spacing and the absence of a continuing trail, and then he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Keep your daughter inside after dark." Not, sounds like a big dog. Not, probably a moose, they walk on two legs funny sometimes. Keep your daughter inside after dark. I asked him what it was. He shrugged in a way that wasn't casual. He turned back to what he'd been doing before I walked in. I stood at the counter for a moment waiting for more and understood there wasn't going to be more and drove home on the fire road with my hands too tight on the steering wheel and the valley spreading out under a sky that was already going dark at 3 in the afternoon the way Alaska skies do in late October, the light collapsing inward from the edges of the world like something being folded away. That night Renata and I talked. Properly, finally, without the euphemisms. She said she wanted to go back to Federal Way. I said I thought we should give it until spring. She said, "Give what until spring?" I said I didn't know. We sat in the kitchen with the wood stove going and the wine we'd been conserving since the move and the darkness pressing against every window, and I asked her, honestly, whether I had made a catastrophic error. She didn't answer that question. She said, "I want to feel safe in my house." I did not say, "I'm not sure this is our house." I thought it. I let it sit at the back of my throat and I swallowed it and I said I would reinforce the door locks tomorrow and check the window latches and we went to bed. I woke at 3:14 a.m. I know this because I looked at the clock on my phone the moment my eyes opened, that specific quality of waking that happens not gradually but instantly, fully, as if something has physically placed you on the other side of sleep with no transition. The room was dark. Renata was breathing beside me, asleep. Buckle, who slept on the rug at the foot of her bed, was not there. I heard him from the hallway, that sustained, low trembling he had since the tracks appeared, except now it was accompanied by a thin, high sound that I had never heard from him before and that I will not try to describe except to say that it was the sound of an animal communicating in a register below threat and above silence, the sound of an animal that has seen what is coming and knows that sound is the only thing left to it. I got up. The hallway was dark and Buckle was at the end of it, at Callie's door, pressed flat to the floor the way dogs press when they are trying to make themselves either very small or very immovable. I walked to him. I put my hand on his back and felt the tremble running through his entire body like current. I looked at Callie's door, which was closed, which was normal, she always slept with it closed. I looked down. The light from under her door. She had a small night light, a plug-in mushroom shape that put out a faint orange glow, visible as a thin line under the door in the dark hallway. That line of orange light was interrupted. Regularly, on one side, in a pattern that made no sense and that my brain processed and refused and then processed again, a shadow. The shadow of feet. Something standing on the other side of Callie's door, very close to it, between the door and the night light. I opened the door. Callie was in her bed, asleep. The room was as it always was, the drawings on the wall, the stuffed animals on the shelf, the mushroom nightlight in the socket by the closet. The window across from her bed was closed. Latched. The curtain hung straight and still. And the floor between the door and her bed was marked with a trail of reddish-brown that was not mud, that was the wrong color and the wrong viscosity for mud, that led from her window to the edge of her bed and stopped there. I stood in the doorway and I could not move. The trail was wet. The trail had been made recently, within the hour, within the last minutes, by something that had come from the window that was now latched and gone to my daughter's bedside and stood there and then ceased to leave any further evidence of itself anywhere in the room. I went to Callie. I checked her. She was warm. She was breathing. She was completely physically unharmed, sleeping with the total unconsciousness of a 6-year-old who has been living outdoors in cold air and sleeping well in the new place she has decided she loves, her face loose and perfect in the orange light. Her left hand was closed in a loose fist on top of the blanket. I don't know what made me look. Some instinct, the animal layer underneath fatherhood that has no language but has vision, has attention, the part of a parent that is always scanning. I looked at her hand and something was wrong with its shape, something was pressing out from between her fingers that didn't belong there, and I opened her hand carefully, the way you open a child's hand when they're asleep, and inside it was a tooth. Not a child's tooth. Not a human tooth of any size I have seen before. Roughly the length of my index finger and curved slightly at the tip, yellowish white and dense and cold in a way that the room was not cold, cold in a way that made me pull my hand back before I decided to pull my hand back. No blood on it. No tissue. Clean, as if it had been cleaned deliberately, as if it had been chosen and placed rather than left accidentally. The root end was intact, massive, the root of a thing that had grown in something very large for a very long time. Callie slept. I stood over her. The trail on the floor was drying at the edges. Buckle had come into the room behind me and was pressed against my left leg, and the trembling had stopped and been replaced by a stillness that was somehow worse. I have held that tooth in my memory every day for 4 months, turning it. I know what it is not. It is not a bare tooth. I have since looked at every bare tooth photograph I can find and the morphology doesn't match. It is not a moose, not an elk, not any ungulate. It is not a dog. The wildlife biologist I contacted in Anchorage, when I described it to her in careful detail, was quiet for a long time and then asked me where in the Susitna Valley we were living, and when I told her, she said, "I'd recommend having it analyzed professionally." She gave me the name of a lab at UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks. She did not offer any preliminary identification. I noted the specific quality of her silence before she answered, and I did not ask her to fill it. We are back in Federal Way now. The cabin is on Zillow again with new photographs. The listing price is lower than what we paid. The agent, a different one this time, called me last week and said she had several inquiries from young couples, remote workers, people looking for something different, people who were tired of the city. She asked if I wanted to write a personal note for the listing, something about the experience of living there, something to help potential buyers connect with the property. I told her no. I told her to just list it as is. She asked if there was anything about the property I wanted her to disclose to interested parties. Legally, she said, there were only specific categories of required disclosure, structural defects, known hazards, that kind of thing. I asked her what category applied to a trail of something dry dark on a 6-year-old's bedroom floor. She didn't say anything. I told her to just sell it, please, as quickly as possible, to whoever would pay. Callie asks about Buckles sometimes. He's fine. He's sleeping on the couch 3 feet from me as I write this, fully recovered, eating normally, the trembling gone entirely since we crossed back into Washington State. She asks when we can go back. She says she liked the snow and the dark and the way the trees looked in the morning. She says she felt like the house was watching her and that she liked it, that it felt like having a friend. I don't answer that. I change the subject. I get her a snack. I do the things parents do when their children say things that, coming from an adult, would be deeply alarming, and that you have to believe, you have to maintain the absolute faith, or simply the imaginative language of a 6-year-old who is processing a big change and nothing more. I maintain that faith. Most days I maintain it completely. But some nights, Federal Way nights, apartment nights, 40 minutes from Seattle nights with the orange streetlight coming through the curtains and the neighbor's TV audible through the shared wall, and every ordinary proof of human proximity that I once found suffocating now feeling like the only thing between me and something I cannot name. Some nights I check on Callie before I sleep. I open her door quietly so I don't wake her. I look at her in the glow of her nightlight, the same mushroom shape she had in Alaska, same orange glow. And I look at her hands. I look at her hands every time. Both of them. Open on the blanket, empty, the way they should be, the way they always are. And I breathe. And I tell myself I am home, we are safe, there is nothing here but family and streetlight and the hum of a city that does not care whether we exist but is spectacularly indifferent in a way that feels, now, like the most comforting thing in the world. I close her door. I go back to bed. Last Thursday I found a mark on the outside of her bedroom window. Federal Way. Apartment building. 3rd floor. Our daughter's window, 3 stories up, facing the parking lot and the streetlight and the complete, surveilled, camera-covered, neighbor-dense geography of suburban American normalcy. A smear on the glass. Outside. Long, lateral, as if something had dragged a broad flat surface slowly across the exterior pane. Too high for a person to reach from the ground. About level with where a face might be, if a face were pressed close. I cleaned it off before Renata saw it. I have not told her. I have not told anyone except you, right now, and I am telling you because I need someone outside my own head to hold this, to carry some portion of it, because the weight of it, the specific, nauseating weight of not knowing whether the thing that came to my daughter's window in the wilderness followed us home or whether something entirely different has taken an interest, and the answer to that question matters enormously, and I cannot find it, and I am running out of places to look. Her hands are still empty when I check. So far. Her hands are still empty. So far. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I am not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't read horoscopes. I never knocked on wood or threw salt over my shoulder. I am 51 years old. I pay my taxes on time. I coached Little League for 8 years in Anchorage, and for 22 years I guided hunters through the interior wilderness of Alaska without losing a single one of them. Not one. I am the kind of man who trusts maps, compasses, GPS coordinates, and the weight of his own experience. I am the kind of man who does not get lost. I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened to me in September, 2 years ago, somewhere between the edge of the Kuskokwim Mountains and the place where the black spruce forest gets so dense it swallows daylight whole by 2 in the afternoon. I need you to understand it because what I'm about to describe will sound insane, and I am not insane. I have been evaluated. I insisted on it myself, 3 weeks after I came home, because I needed someone with a medical degree to look me in the eyes and tell me my brain was structurally sound. It is. That's what makes this so terrifying. It started the way all disasters start, quietly, with nothing. A client canceled last minute, some wild executive from Houston who booked a week-long Dall sheep hunt and then got cold feet about the flight from Fairbanks into the bush. Happens. So I decided to go out alone, just for the day, scout a route I've been wanting to assess for the following season. A ridgeline northeast of the Yentna River drainage, roughly 60 miles from the nearest paved road. I'd done routes like that hundreds of times. I had my GPS unit, a Garmin inReach, fully charged, my compass, my topo maps printed on waterproof paper, my .44 Magnum on my hip for bears, for days of emergency food even though I was planning to be back before dark. I had everything. I was, by any rational measure, prepared. The morning was gray the way Alaska mornings in September are always gray, that particular shade of pewter that sits low on the mountains and makes the entire world feel like it's being viewed through frosted glass. I've always loved that. Back in my 20s, when I first moved up from Oregon, I used to find the solitude up here romantic. The silence. The absolute, crushing silence that you simply do not get anywhere in the lower 48. You can stand in a clearing in the Alaskan interior and feel, with complete physical certainty, that you are the only human being within 100 miles. That sensation used to fill me with something close to joy. I want you to remember that. Because that same sensation, the one I used to love, was the thing that would eventually hollow me out from the inside like something using my chest cavity as a place to nest. I made good time in the first 2 hours. The terrain was familiar enough: tussock grass, alder thickets, the occasional black spruce standing skeletal and wind-warped against the ridge. I checked my GPS every 30 minutes out of habit, not necessity. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I noted a good glassing knob for sheep at elevation, ate half a protein bar, drank some water, felt the particular satisfaction of a man who is very good at what he does operating inside his area of mastery. Then I walked into the trees. It wasn't a decision exactly. The route I'd planned clipped the edge of a spruce stand, maybe a quarter-mile of timber before opening back onto the alpine tundra above. I'd done it a dozen times before in other drainages. You lower your head, watch your footing on the root systems, follow the bearing, come out the other side. Simple. The trees swallowed the gray sky overhead and the light dropped immediately, the way it does under a dense spruce canopy, not darkness exactly but a dimness, a muffling of the world. The smell of wet lichen and rotting wood filled my lungs. My footsteps went quiet in the moss. I checked my GPS bearing, 047 degrees northeast. Fine. I walked. I checked again at what felt like 15 minutes. Still good. I was moving through correctly. The trees all looked the same, the way spruce always do, thin and black-barked and crowded together with their lower branches dead and brittle and pointing inward like broken fingers, but that was normal. That was always how it looked. I kept my bearing and I kept walking. Then something happened that I cannot explain and have never been able to explain. The trees changed. Not dramatically. Not the way they change in horror movies with some thunderclap revelation. Subtly. The spruce around me were slightly larger than they'd been. The ground cover was different, more feather moss, less tussock grass. The root systems underfoot were bigger, older, the roots of trees that had been growing for a century or more. The kind of forest you don't find at the edge of a stand. You find it in the middle. I stopped walking. I checked my GPS. The screen showed me exactly where I was, a blue dot sitting inside the timber, bearing still 047 degrees. Everything looked correct on the device. I looked at my topo map. I looked back at my GPS. I took a compass bearing manually. Everything agreed. I was where I was supposed to be, moving in the direction I was supposed to be moving, and I should have been emerging from the far side of the tree stand in approximately 4 more minutes. I kept walking. 15 minutes later I was still in the trees. And they were still getting bigger. That was when the fear arrived. Not the loud, screaming fear of a near-miss car accident. The other kind. The quiet kind that settles into your stomach like cold water and starts to spread through your organs one by one. I stopped again. I breathed slowly the way I'd taught myself to breathe in moments of danger, 6 counts in, hold for 4, 8 counts out. I took stock. GPS, functioning. Compass, functioning. Maps, in my hand. I was not lost. It was not possible that I was lost. And yet the forest around me had no edge. I turned around and walked back on a bearing of 227 degrees, exactly the reverse of my entry bearing. 30 minutes later I had not found the tundra I'd come from. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because if you've never been deep in a wilderness with no landmarks, no cell signal, and no sound except the wind in the spruce tops 60 feet above you, you cannot fully understand what that does to a human nervous system. Your brain, which has spent your entire life inside a grid of streets and buildings and cellular towers and other people, begins to experience something for which it has no category. The absence of reference. The ground under your feet stops feeling like a surface you're moving across and starts feeling like a treadmill. A trick. Something that looks like progress and produces none. I sat down on a root and I said out loud, to nobody, this is not happening. But it was happening. And the light was dropping. In September, in the Alaskan interior, you lose light faster than you can psychologically prepare for. By 4 in the afternoon it is already thinking about night, that particular gray deepening into purple at the edge of the sky that anywhere else in America would be beautiful, and here, alone, with no shelter and no edge to the forest you're trapped in, is the most frightening thing you have ever seen in your life. I had my emergency bivy sack. I had food. I was not going to die of exposure. But the rational part of my brain that knew that was getting very small and very far away, and the older part, the part underneath reason, the part that is still an animal, that part was beginning to make decisions. I started moving faster. I know now that was wrong. When you're disoriented in terrain, moving fast makes it worse. You know this. I knew it then. But knowing and doing are very different things when the trees are identical in every direction and the light is going and you haven't heard a sound other than your own breathing in what feels like hours. I checked my GPS again. Still showing my position. Still showing 047 as north-northeast. Still making complete sense on paper. I started to wonder, in a way that felt genuinely unhinged, whether the GPS was broken. I have never once in 22 years wondered if my GPS was broken. I pressed my palm flat against the bark of the nearest spruce and I felt it, cold, real, utterly indifferent, and I thought about my wife, Karen, who was at home in Anchorage watching something on Netflix and probably wondering when I'd text to say I was back at the truck. I thought about my daughter, Mara, who was a junior at UAA, University of Alaska Anchorage, studying environmental science. I thought about these ordinary, specific, American things, Netflix, a university campus, a parking lot with a truck in it, and they felt so remote they might as well have been on another planet. That's the thing nobody tells you about true wilderness. It doesn't just separate you physically from your life. It separates you mentally. The context of your existence, who you are, what you do, the whole scaffolding of American normalcy, just dissolves, and underneath it there is nothing but the sound of your own heartbeat and the trees that go on forever. I made myself stop. I made myself build a fire, though the wood was wet and it took 40 minutes and 3 fire starters. I set up my bivvy. I ate. I drank water. I turned on my inReach and sent a distress ping, because even though the rational part of me was still insisting this was solvable and explicable and would be embarrassing in the morning, the animal part of me had taken over navigation by then and it sent that ping without asking permission. I did not sleep. I don't think I slept. The fire burned and I watched the darkness between the trees, and the darkness did not move or change or breathe. It just sat there being absolute, and I sat inside it, and I was more frightened than I have ever been, more than the time a Brownie Bluff charged me on the Mulchatna, more than the time an engine failed on a bush flight out of McGrath, more than anything. Because those things had a cause and a scale. This didn't. This was just trees. Just direction. Just the feeling, growing more certain with each hour, that whatever governed the ordinary logic of the world had quietly stopped applying inside this particular stand of spruce and had been replaced by something else, something patient and enormous and entirely unconcerned with me. I heard nothing all night. No owls. No rodents in the brush. No wind. Nothing. Just silence so completed as texture, that specific Alaskan silence that I used to call beautiful and now understood was not silence at all but the sound of something enormous holding its breath. At what my watch said was 7:14 in the morning, the morning was still a rumor, a lightning at the periphery. I packed my gear and started walking again. I moved slowly. I moved methodically. I kept my bearing at 047 and I counted my steps. At step 600 I came out of the trees. I stood on the tundra in the gray morning light and I looked back at the tree line behind me and I breathed so hard my vision went white at the edges. I checked my watch. I checked my GPS. I looked at the topo map. According to every instrument I owned, I had been inside that stand of spruce for 40 minutes. My fire, I looked back and could see the gray smear of smoke from it rising above the treetops. I'd built that fire. I'd sat beside it for what felt like 7 or 8 hours. My emergency food supply, which I brought for 4 days, was almost entirely gone. I'd eaten compulsively through the night, I realized, the way you do when your body is burning calories in a state of sustained terror. I checked my watch again. 7:14 a.m. I'd entered the trees around noon the day before. The rescue team found me 40 minutes later. 2 state troopers and a wildlife biologist who'd been in Talkeetna when my in-reach ping hit. They were stunned at how close to my entry point I was. They said I looked like I'd been through something bad. One of them asked if I'd seen a bear. I had not seen a bear. The aerial photos they'd taken during the search, standard protocol with in-reach pings, showed the timber stand I'd been in. From above it looked like nothing. A dark smudge of spruce maybe 400 yards across, sitting between the tundra on either side, the kind of thing you'd glance at from a Cessna and forget immediately. 400 yards. I told my wife about it that night in our kitchen in Anchorage, sitting under the fluorescent light with the sound of the refrigerator humming and a pot of soup she'd made on the stove, and I watched her face go through the stages: concern, confusion, the careful blankness she gets when she doesn't know what to say. She held my hands across the table. She said all the right things. I went back to work that following spring. Different clients, different drainage. I haven't taken anyone into the interior near the Kuskokwim since then. I tell people it's because I've been focusing on coastal brown bear hunting near Kodiak and king salmon. That's partially true. The real reason is something I noticed 3 weeks after I came home, when I was doing laundry and found my field journal in the pocket of my hunting pants. I use it to log terrain features, animal sign, GPS coordinates. I record everything. 22 years of field journals, all of them filled with my handwriting in small, precise, controlled capital letters. I opened it to the last entry. 216 pages. Every single page filled, front and back, edge to edge, in my handwriting. Symbols. Not letters, not words, not any language I've ever seen or studied. Dense, repeating symbols arranged in patterns that I do not recognize and cannot describe except to say that they are organized. Intentional. Precise. The pen pressure consistent across every single page, as if written calmly and without urgency. I don't remember writing a single word. I had the journal analyzed by a linguistics professor at UAA, the same university where my daughter studies. He told me the symbols weren't a known language, not a cipher he could identify, not automatic writing in any clinical sense he was familiar with. He photographed every page. He called me a month later, at 11 o'clock at night, and said he wanted to discuss a pattern he'd found, a structural repetition across the pages that he found, in his words, genuinely disturbing. I haven't called him back. The journal is in a box in my storage unit now. Locked. I don't know why I locked it, since it's just a notebook, just paper and ink, just symbols that mean nothing. I locked it because some part of me, the part that spent 40 minutes inside those trees, the part that has no name and lives below reason, that part is very certain the symbols are not meaningless. And that part is also certain, with a cold and absolute conviction that I have never been able to shake, that I was not the one who wrote them. My father used to say that the ocean doesn't owe you anything. Not a catch, not a living, not a return trip home. He said it the way men of his generation said things they understood completely but could never fully explain, flatly, without drama, the way you'd state a law of physics. The ocean doesn't owe you anything. He'd fished out of Dutch Harbor for 30 years before his knees gave out and he retired to a double wide in Wasilla, and in those 30 years he never once talked about what scared him out there. Not once. I thought, when I was young, that it was because nothing scared him. I understand now that it was because some things are too large to put into words without losing something essential about them, some core of truth that language cannot hold. You open your mouth and it falls out like water through a net. This is my attempt anyway. Consider it a warning, though I'm not certain what exactly you'd be warned against. Fishing? The Bering Sea? The particular human arrogance of assuming that because you have done something many times without consequence, the consequence has been permanently removed? I was 34 years old when it happened. I'd been crewing on commercial fishing vessels since I was 22, crabbers, longliners, trawlers, whatever was hiring out of Kodiak or Dutch Harbor or on Alaska at the beginning of a season. I was good at it the way some people are good at a thing without being able to explain why. I had sea legs from the beginning. I didn't get sick. I could work the 20-hour shifts that break men older and larger than me, and I had a tolerance for the particular claustrophobic misery of a working boat at sea that most people discover, after 2 or 3 days, they absolutely do not possess. My girlfriend at the time, a woman named Diane who taught 3rd grade in Anchorage and had never been on anything larger than a kayak, used to ask me how I did it. How I stood being out there for weeks with the same 6 men on a vessel the size of a city bus, surrounded by nothing but gray water in every direction, no phone signal, no internet, no privacy, no quiet, nothing familiar. I told her I liked the simplicity of it. You are on the boat, you do the work, you come home. There are no meetings, no traffic, no bureaucratic friction between your effort and its result. You put the net in, you pull it back. That's all. I believed that completely. Right up until the night we pulled the net back and the simplicity ended forever. We were 3 weeks into a pollock season on a mid-sized trawler called the Margadel, working a stretch of the Bering Sea roughly 140 nautical miles southwest of St. Paul Island. The captain was a Norwegian-American named Håkon Dries who had been running vessels in Alaskan waters for over 2 decades, quiet, extraordinarily competent, the kind of man who reads weather the way other people read facial expressions. There were 6 of us in the crew besides Håkon. I won't use their real names here because some of them are still fishing and I don't have their permission and because, frankly, I don't know how much of what I remember is fully reliable anymore. I will call my bunk partner Marcus. The 2 deckhands who worked my shift I will call Eddie and Pell. The season had been good. Better than good, we were running ahead of quota and the mood on the boat was the particular loosened up relief of men who can see money clearly in the near future. We were joking at meals. Somebody had a portable speaker and we were playing music in the processing hold while we worked. There is a specific quality to the happiness of commercial fishermen when a season is going well that I've never encountered anywhere else in my life, raw, slightly manic, physical. You are tired all the way to the marrow of your bones and you are also giddy with it, with the tiredness and the cold and the salt and the fact that you are alive and productive in one of the most inhospitable working environments on earth and it is all actually working. That is what the mood was like on the night of the 3rd week. I remember the exact feeling of standing on the stern deck at 2 in the morning, watching the net winch bring the trawl back to the surface. The sky above the Bering Sea at that hour in the season was a shade of dark blue I have never seen reproduced in any painting or photograph, absolute, depthless, salted with stars that you never see from shore because the light from shore kills them. The water around the boat was black and had that particular Bering Sea texture in calm conditions, slightly oily, barely moving, like the surface of something that is mostly held still by its own weight. I remember thinking, with the idle contentment of a man who is exactly where he's supposed to be, that there was nowhere on earth like this and that I was lucky to know it. That thought has a different quality in my memory now. Like finding a photograph of yourself smiling outside a building that burned down an hour later. The net was heavy. Hawken noted it from the wheelhouse, called down to say we were pulling a good hole, to watch the block carefully. We watched it. The web came up gleaming and silver and alive with pollock and the underwater lights, hundreds of them, the net bulging and pulsing. It was a beautiful catch. The hydraulic block whined. The trawl doors swung inboard. Eddie was already moving toward the cot end, the terminal bag of the net where the catch concentrates, ready to release it into the hold. He stopped. He stopped walking and he stood very still, and that stopped me, because Eddie was not a man who stood still. Eddie was kinetic, permanently in motion, the kind of man who could not hold a conversation without gesturing. He stood on the deck completely motionless for 3 full seconds, which doesn't sound like long, but on a working stern deck at 2 in the morning with a full net coming aboard is an eternity. Then he turned to me and his face was wrong. I have been trying for 2 years to describe what I mean by wrong. It wasn't pale. It wasn't frightened in any expression I'd catalogued before. It was emptied out. Like something had walked through his face and taken all its familiar organization with it. He just looked at me and he didn't say anything and he pointed at the cot end. The net was full of hair. Not exclusively. The fish were there, hundreds of pounds of pollock, but woven through the mesh of the cot end, tangled into it, knotted around the individual twine knots with a density and deliberateness that was nauseating to look at, was hair. Human hair. Dark, long, straight hair in quantities that made no sense, that could not have come from 1 person or 2 people or even 10 people. It was matted into the mesh like something that had been building there for years, accreting slowly in the darkness below us, waiting for exactly this moment to be seen. Some of it had begun to float free of the mesh in the wind off the water, lifting and drifting across the deck in thin dark filaments, and I watched one of those filaments drift across my boot and I stepped back from it before I understood I was stepping back. Pell said something in a language I didn't recognize. He was from a small village on the Alaska peninsula and occasionally said things I couldn't parse, but this was different. This was guttural and short and sounded less like words than like a sound a person makes involuntarily when they see something that the brain hasn't finished processing yet. He said it once and then he was quiet. I called up to Hawken. The silence that came back from the wheelhouse lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Hawken came down to the stern deck himself, which he did not do often during active retrieval. He walked to the cot end. He looked at it for a long time. His face did not do what Eddie's face had done. Hawken's face never did much of anything. But he stood there longer than I have ever seen him stand still, and the muscle in his jaw worked, and then he said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "Cut it." He meant cut the cot end loose. Release the entire terminal bag, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of catch, back into the sea. I have never seen a captain order that before except in a genuine emergency of the vessel. Hawken turned and walked back to the wheelhouse without explaining, and we cut it and we watched it go back under the black surface of the Bering Sea, and then we stood on the deck in the cold for a while without talking. The trawl doors swung against the hull and made their hollow metallic sound, and the stars were still overhead, and somewhere below us the net full of hair was sinking back into whatever it had come from. Nobody talked about it that night. That is the thing I need you to understand, the thing that has disturbed me more consistently over the past 2 years than any other aspect of what happened. We were 6 men on a boat with nowhere to go and nothing to do but work and sleep and eat, and not one of us talked about what we had seen. Not at the meal an hour later, not in the bunk room, not on the deck while we reset the gear. It sat among us like a 7th person, present, breathing, occupying space, and we all moved carefully around it and said nothing. I don't fully understand why. When I have tried to examine it rationally, I arrive at the conclusion that some part of each of us understood, instinctively and immediately, that this was a thing that could only be discussed under very specific conditions, on land, in daylight, with other people nearby. That out here, in the dark, over whatever was down there, to speak about it was to invite it upward. So we didn't speak about it. And individually, privately, we must have each pressed it down into some lower cabinet of the mind and latched it shut, because the season continued. 3 more days on the grounds, then the run back to Dutch Harbor to offload and refuel, and in Dutch Harbor there was the controlled chaos of processing facilities and other crew and the particular shore leave energy that takes over men who have been at sea for weeks, and it was easy, startlingly, horrifyingly easy, to let the memory go soft at the edges. To stop turning it over. To place it in the category of things that happen once and will not happen again and require no further investigation. Marcus talked to me about it once. Just once, 2 days out of Dutch Harbor on our way back to the grounds. We were in the bunk room, off shift, and I was reading and he was lying on his back staring at the ceiling of the bunk above him with the particular quality of stillness that is not rest. He said, without preamble, "You know the zones." I said yes. He said, "You know why we don't set gear in the zones?" I said I assumed it was bad bottom, rocks, debris, things that would damage the gear. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's what I assumed too." He didn't say anything else. I didn't ask. The engine of the Margaret ran below us and the water ran along the hull and the bunk creaked in the slight swell and that was all. I have thought about that exchange almost every day since. The terrible weight of that second assumption, the one we both held and never examined, that there was a rational, mechanical explanation for the no-go zones, and how effortlessly it had concealed the other possibility. The possibility that the captains who'd learned those zones, who moved away from them without explanation, who changed course in the middle of the night without waking the crew, had seen something. Had pulled something back. Had made the same decision Hawken made, silently, and had passed the knowledge down not as a story but as a behavior, a reflex, the way you train an animal to avoid a part of the fence that delivers a shock. You don't explain. You just make sure nobody goes there. What's in the zones? I don't know. I've thought about all the rational explanations, old fishing gear, lost vessels, things that drift and accumulate in deep water topographic features. I've researched it. Loosely. The way you research something when you're not sure you actually want an answer. What I know is that the Bering Sea has taken more vessels and more people than any other body of water in American territorial range. I know that Dutch Harbor has been one of the deadliest ports in the country for most of the time humans have been fishing those waters commercially. I know that there are families in Alaska and Sandpoint and King Cove who have sent men out and not received them back, and that the sea kept what it took. I know that hair is among the most durable biological materials on the human body, resistant to decomposition in cold water, sometimes preserved for decades. I know all of that. And none of it, assembled together, fully accounts for the quantity of what we pulled up, or for the way it was arranged in the mesh, or for the feeling, this is the part one have never been able to adequately explain to anyone, not to Diane, not to the therapist I saw briefly the winter after, the feeling that accompanied the sight of it. Not revulsion, exactly. Not horror, exactly. Something older and more specific than either of those words. The feeling of having accidentally seen something that was never meant to be seen. Of having briefly reversed a direction that only runs one way. Of having, for one terrible moment, forced something from below to briefly join the world above, and of knowing, as Hawken clearly knew, that the correct and urgent response was to send it back and move away and never, ever speak of what it had shown you of itself. I left commercial fishing after that season. Told Diane it was time, that my body couldn't take the winters anymore, which was partially true. I took a job with a freight company in Anchorage. I go to dinner parties now. I own a coffee maker that costs more than my first truck. I have not been on open water in 14 months. These are the ways I have tried to rebuild the ordinary American scaffolding of my life, the routine, the comfort, the blessed predictable friction of paying a mortgage and worrying about whether the car needs new tires, all of it functioning as insulation between me and the memory of that night. It works, mostly. Mostly I don't think about it. But last month Diane found something in the drain of our bathroom sink. She called me in and showed me and asked if I knew where it was coming from. It was hair. Long, dark, straight hair, far more than should have been possible given that Diane's hair is blonde and cut to her chin. She said it had been building up for weeks. She said she'd been meaning to mention it. She said it was probably nothing, probably just a clog somewhere in the building's plumbing, probably nothing. She stood there looking at it and I stood in the bathroom doorway and I watched my own hands grip the door frame. The pipes in our building run down through the floor, through the building's foundation, through the soil. They run down and eventually, through some route too long and complicated to trace, they connect to everything. To the water table. To the rivers that run to the coast. To the coast that gives itself to the sea. I didn't say any of this to Diane. I ran the tap and watched it spiral down. I told her I'd call the super in the morning. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the pipes in the walls, that low, distant, conversational sound that pipes make in old buildings, which I have never before in my life found anything other than completely unremarkable. It sounds different to me now. It sounds like something very far below, pressing upward. Patient. Unhurried. Waiting for the moment when the right question gets asked and the net goes down too deep. It always sounds like it is getting closer.